Great. So welcome everyone to today's social system mapping session, social system mapping sense-making session for today, September 5th, 2022. Happy to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm your host. I'm Christine Capper, co-founder of SumMap and catalyst of social system mapping and the social system mapping community of practice. Usually I have a partner in crime, an assistant who helps me with the technology, and I'm on my own today because she is out camping. So sometimes I'm a little rough around the edges of what am I doing here. I've got a lot more moving parts than usual, but I'm sure we'll be fine. And I appreciate that. I'll trust you'll bear with me. So for those of you who are new, what this is essentially, the community of practice, social system mapping, is a vision about a possibility. We believe that social system mapping can help transformation networks, action communities, whatever they, however they label themselves, these kinds of groups, we believe that it can help them get to self-organizing more quickly and more wisely, and can catalyze greater potential in those kinds of initiatives. So this is really about, these sessions that we do on Monday mornings is about living into that possibility. It's also an opportunity to learn about this kind of mapping, as well as to get familiar with and literate in the body of theory that supports our belief in the potential and that informs our mapping practice and is an essential ingredient in our map reading process. So it's also an opportunity for you to contribute your own experience and expertise to this emerging mapping practice, because it's not just about theory, it's also about lived experience and insight into the dynamics of people working together in complex circumstances. So it's a community of practice and field building and letting somebody in. And another, hang on, I have a couple of people to let in. I think we're, okay. Just gonna pause for a moment. Welcome, Jan, if you'd like to do a quick mic check. We're in the middle of getting started, but.
Good morning, sorry.
Okay, welcome. Siggy, welcome. Do you want to do a quick mic check?
Yeah, hi, Christina. I'm actually driving, but I'm on a Zoom because the traffic is so bad before I reach to the laptop. So within 5 minutes, I will be in a proper place to introduce myself.
Okay, good. We'll be happy to see you then.
Okay.
Drive carefully. Okay. So, yeah, and then finally, so it's the last part of what I was saying about this is that it's also a community of practice and field building with the intent for all of us who are mappers and who are part of this community to become carriers of a culture of generative transformation, and to explore how social system mapping can help develop that culture of generative transformation. So it's both about community building and mapping together and how they can inform each other. So it's not just a community for people who make maps, it's also for map visionaries and map sense makers and anyone else who's interested in this intersection of social system mapping and cultures of transformation. So we welcome you to join us in these sessions and in our also community building activities in whatever way feels well, you would be interested in participating. So our agenda for today, pretty simple. Going to do some introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what social system mapping is. I'm going to talk about the HSD, which is Human Systems Dynamics Theory of Change, and the CDE model. And then we're going to take that, some of what we talk about with the theory of change and the CDE model, and use it to start to think about defining systems of dominance and systems of connection. And we do that because we say that the purpose of social system mapping is to support a shift from systems of dominance and extraction and exploitation to systems of connection and reverence and regeneration. And so we've been saying that for years, and but that sort of begs the question of what do we actually mean? And so we're sort of launching into an initiative to start to get clear about what do we mean by that in a real sense, in a way that we can be clear enough about it to start to practice it together in a day-to-day way. So we're going to start that exploration, sort of come out of the CDE model and start that exploration today with that. And that'll just be a beginning of that exploration. But before we do that, I'm going to give you, and where did I, hang on, I have to stop sharing for a second because I don't remember where I put the right link when I was preparing. Okay, so I'm using this, nope, that's not what we want. I'm putting a link in a second into the chat. And for those of you who are able, and I recognize that not all of you are able to do this at the moment, given, like if you're in a car, that wouldn't be a good idea. So if you can, we'd love for you to click on that link, and there's that will be sort of our input, where we'll be gathering some of your responses about some of the questions that I'm going to ask further on. And so we're just starting that right here. So right now, if you click on that link, there will be a place where it asks for your name, pronouns, location, and a network that you're part of or working with that you are great. Grace has got the gist, working with the stolen lands of the Manahoac peoples and working in conservation. So thank you for that. And if the rest of you could take a moment to do what Grace just did, if you're able. If you're not, don't try, please. And if you're not going to, or if you're done, if you could just use the raise your hand icon, then I'll know when to, so that I know that you're good, then I can move forward.
Christine, I'll do mine within 5 minutes. Yeah. Bear with me. The traffic is really bad today in London.
Sorry that you are, anyway, yes, no demands from you, Tiggy, for you, from me. And Jim Best, who's working, showing up for racial justice in the Bay Area. Jan Kearse in Maine, Development Foundation. Economic development networks with a current focus on forestry, fishing, aquaculture. Cool. Yeah. We have a Brian Dowling, who's not with us today, but who is often with us, is also very focused on economic development. And Gabe in Montana, Medicine Forward. Great.
Christine, I'm not seeing the entries come up. Am I doing something wrong?
No, I am. Thank you for saying that. Screen share. Okay.
Or do we click on upload image at the bottom of the item?
No.
Okay.
You know, I mean, if you wanted to put I think you could put an image into your content.
Oh, okay. I see.
That's what I think that would do. So, anyway, can you see them? Can you see it now, Jim?
Yes. Yes. Thanks.
For those of you who are not familiar with this, so now you'll have both your Zoom dashboard where you can see me, and when I'm sharing my screen, you'll see my screen share. And then you'll also have the AHA slides input, which, or interface, which you can input information into. I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. And if anyone's catching up, I believe it will still let you. But at any rate, feel free to just, if the technology is annoying or challenging, feel free to just put your comments in the chat instead, and I will do my best to notice them and share them with the group or verbalize. And also, as we're going through today's session, things are coming up for you, questions, just other kinds of comments. Feel free to put them in the chat as well. That's part of our process, and I'm, as I said, doing a couple roles today, but I will do my best to keep an eye on that. So next question in the slide interface is, how familiar are you with social system mapping? So I know some of us are super familiar and some of us are brand new to it. And it's good to just have a sense of where the group is at and how wide that spread is today. Okay.
How do we get back to that again so we can answer that question?
Good question. It depends on your. It's like going from a window to your Zoom screen. So
Okay.
if you're in Windows, Alt and Tab will bring up all your open things. Does that help?
Got it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Toggling back and forth until you're familiar with it, it can be a little bit tricky to understand where we are. Okay. So we've got a couple people with a rough idea, person who can find their way around it, someone who's worked on creating and teaching, and I think we have maybe another person or two who can't input right now. So I'm going to just assume that it's not absolute. Okay, Grace is not able to enter. How familiar are you with social system mapping? Just little, medium, lot. And you can just throw it in the chat. That'd be great. Would help me. And I'm going to move forward on the slides. The next question is, how familiar are you with human systems dynamics? Human systems dynamics, for those of you who aren't familiar, is one framework or one school of thought or approach to systems thinking in the context of human systems. So just to help me know where you're at with that, also would like to have that. And if you can't put it in the AHA slide, feel free to throw it in the chat. And if can't do that, we'll just hope that I can be as helpful as I can. I mean, that's my goal for everybody in any case. So let's just see how this goes. Okay. So we've got sort of a 50-50 split as far as I can see at this point in a rough idea and a bit of introduction. So I'm going to move forward. And one last question, if you can put it in there for the moment. How did you hear about this session? No, that's not the last, but how did you hear about this session? It's always really useful for me to learn how people are coming to us, because it speaks directly to the network of networks, this global network of people working on this shift that I referred to. And I like to sort of see the connections and know where we're coming from. Through the Tamarack newsletter. I did not know that they were commenting on our work. That's great. I know how Siggy gets here, so I don't. Great. So we have the Connecting to Change the World book getting referenced. It's on my list shelf somewhere, but I can't find it quickly. Part of the community for several years. Great. Okay, I'm going to move forward. And then, okay, so my hopes for you today, and is that you come away with a sense of the potential that we're inspired by. I know you won't understand, that you won't, but I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. And so I'll feel successful if you get a little bit of just a taste of like, yeah, that seems cool. I'm not expecting any of us to have a clear picture of how it all works, how it all fits together, because that sort of takes some time, but just a sense of that. I hope you will at least have that, that you come away at least a little bit curious about how human systems dynamics and social system mapping complement each other and can work together to amplify either one on its own, but together even better, the work that you're already doing. and that you'll have been introduced to or deepened your understanding of the human systems dynamics theory of change, which is very simple and yet very deep. And that you'll take away some kinds of, some ideas about the kinds of systemic patterns that apply in our network to the degree that's, but then apply in all networks. How can we all as networks start to move, not just our external targets, but our internal ways of showing up and being, move from systems of dominance to systems connection, not as a, not as an external subject that we're working on, but also as an internal way we're showing up. So that's what we're trying to think about and begin to define in those system definitions. So that's my hopes for you, but what are you most curious about in today's session? And that can go into the AHA slides or it can go into this chat. And I recognize not everybody is able to interact with either of those at the moment. But I just want to give you space to think about that, if not share it. But I'd love you to share it. So just continuing to practice and deepen. Very useful, very important sort of a point, I think. And I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead. Okay. So what is social system mapping? For those of you who are new to this, the social system map is essentially a mashup. It uses two tools, Kumu for data visualization, for visualizing the data, and SumMap for gathering the data. It gathers data about all of these kinds of maps. So we call it a social system map, a mashup of a system map, stakeholder map, an asset map, social network map, and a concept map. So all of these things are kind of can be in a social system map and show up in social system mapping. And but although there's a lot of visual similarities amongst most of these maps, there's dots and there's lines that connect them. What's different and unique, and here comes Siggy back again. What's different and unique about a social system map is that it includes dimensions from all of these maps, not just one set of dimensions, not just system causes and not just stakeholder types, but puts them together so that it becomes far more layered and dense and complex and dynamic than any one of these kinds of maps on their own. And that is to help us. It's also a process more than a product. It's online, it's interactive, so that a whole network, it's accessible to all the members of the network. You don't have to make it that way, but that's certainly our advice. And that it's an iterative, emergent, dynamic, and ongoing collective practice, so that as you understand your system or your network more deeply, you can, or maybe as you want to understand it more deeply, you can add new questions to the map and then have new data to work with. Or you may discover that the things you've mapped already need to change. So as I already referred to, it's about systemic transformation. It's about supporting a global movement working to shift from systems of dominance, exploitation, and extraction to systems of connection, reverence, and regeneration. And welcome back, Siggy. It's great to see you. And we understand that systemic transformation requires strong networks of wise change agents. And there are basically, with social system mapping, two fundamental sort of parallel interwoven shifts that we're working on. And those are the shift from a deep understanding of ourselves as separate from nature, from each other, from the planet, from that separate self and sort of competitive and dominating and violent way of knowing self and world, to an interbeing self, a more collaborative, cooperative recognition of what's good for the planet and for each other is good for ourselves as well. So that's the relational shift that we focus on. And then there's a cognitive shift, which is moving away from a mechanistic worldview, from a sort of a top-down mechanical systems understanding, to a complex adaptive systems worldview, or a living systems worldview, where we understand, where we're looking from what are the principles of life, and how do they apply, and how can we work with them as opposed to against them to repair our planet and to create the world we want to live in. So we say that social system mapping can, if it's used well, can help us work on both of those levels at the same time, in tandem together, woven together, as opposed to often we see people working on, or networks or groups focusing primarily on the how do we be, how do we show up, how do we be good, good connecting people, the relational shift. Or we see a lot of eggheady systems thinkers who are like, puffing their pipes and, doing causal loop diagrams, but they're not actually paying attention to who they are in the process and how their own biases are showing up. And so they're still looking at it as a sort of as an object that they're researching. So we're trying to do them both together at the same time. And we think social system mapping can help with that. That's our major premise and the potential that we see. So before we jump into a little bit of that theory, I want to know if you can share, what are the biggest challenges that you experience in your networks currently? And that, again, that's in the AHA slides. There's a question for that. And I'll give you a moment. Stimulating collaboration when there's not an immediate task to be done. That's an interesting one. I say it's interesting because my own personal experience feels like there's all kinds of tasks to be done, and that's when it's hard to get people to collect. Like, there's stuff to do and I can't find anybody to do it. And the truth is, often it's me not asking, but so that was just a different take on that same thing, which I thought was interesting. Not the same thing, a different take on when it's a challenge. And I can't tell if other people are working on it or not. Okay, great. Power dynamics, tendency to stick to old ways of thinking, resistance to change. Holding the glue together for the groups within the network, different levels of commitment and action, all really valuable, important things to be trying to figure out how to deal with. Dominant culture that suppresses minoritized voices and opinions, inability to experiment, yes. And then currently realizing more and more the cultural shift I want to see is an internal shift to be constantly aware of. So all of these things are things that either some of us in this community have sort of started to learn ways that a social system map can help us address some of these deeper issues. For instance, the dominant culture stuff. A map can actually help us see what's going on. It might not help us see why it's going on, and it might not help us fix it, but often I've noticed that the dominant culture doesn't even recognize that it's suppressing minoritized voices or opinion. It doesn't even recognize the marginalization that it's enacting. And just seeing that on a map can be a wake-up call and can be a very less threatening and less personalized way of surfacing that dynamic of saying, oh, but we see the dominant culture people are in the middle and the minoritized voices are, are either not present or they're in the margins. And so that kind of thing, just being able to surface that kind of information can give us a tool for a foundation for a dialogue that can begin that process. And then we can, part of the theory of social system mapping is that we can then take that deeper and deeper over time as we get clearer and clearer about what we really need to be seeing and understanding. So things like power dynamics, things about resistance to change, inability to experiment, that I think is really interesting and is part of the whole sort of, I mean, it may not be in your context, but often it looks like the deeper part of the inability to experiment comes from that mechanistic worldview, because we have to know everything ahead of time. We can't take risks. We can't break it down into small pieces and just try a little at a time, because that would be that, you know, in a mechanistic worldview, we have to sort of have everything figured out ahead of time. So I feel like that's part of that kind of system that we're working with, whether mechanistic or a living system, is part of that. So all of those things can be in an ideal world or in an ideal practice, or maybe I shouldn't say ideal, but just in a very good practice, can be part of what we're doing when we're working with the social system out. Okay, thanks for all that, for sharing your thoughts, and I'll try to touch back on those as we proceed. So this is the human systems dynamics theory of change. I'm going to dig into it a little bit, but this is the high level. We have a complex adaptive system, which basically means a living system, which is, so, you know, it's not a machine system. It will change as things change within it. It will respond. Often what it will do is get perturbations, you know, it'll get some pressure to do one thing, and then it will change a little bit, but then it will revert back to its normal status quo. So how that works and how we work with that is, you know, the point of the human systems dynamics theory of change. So we have complex adaptive system, we have adaptive action, and we have pattern logic. I'm going to dig a little more into each of these. So the three conditions of a complex adaptive system. So in human systems dynamics, based on, you know, research of lots of different systems thinking approaches, a complex adaptive system or a living system has three fundamental conditions that make it a system, that hold it as a system that stays together and does something, and that make it adaptive and make it adaptive. And the quality of each of these conditions is what will determine the direction it changes, how fast it changes, how quickly it reverts back. If it fails to revert back, what does it do? So these three conditions sort of define how a system works. One of which is a container, and we're going to think about containers some more in a minute, but a container, I'll get to that in a minute. So one of which is a container, one of which is differences. So if you have a monoculture, you do not have a complex adaptive system, you have a very fragile system that is not going to be very robust and adaptive, and you have exchanges. So again, the dynamics of the container, the differences, and the exchanges are what will define and drive system change. So what is a container? A container is any bounding condition. So anything that sort of distinguishes what's inside the system versus what's outside of the system. So teams can be containers, locations, identities, purposes, organizations, values, perspectives. Individuals can be containers. For instance, for a while, President Obama was a container, and for a while, Bernie Sanders was a container, and for a while, and still Donald Trump is a container of sorts. So you can have containers around personalities, celebrities, networks and communities that are defined as such are containers. And the thing that we want to think about when we're thinking about containers is the container, how big is it, and versus how small, like what size is it? How many agents is it defining as inside of itself, as opposed to outside of itself? So size of the container is a piece of it. The permeability of the container. Every container has boundaries. Our bodies have skin. Our cells have cell boundaries. Our families have some kind of containerishness, depending on how we define them. But those boundaries can be super rigid, like a prison's boundaries. The boundary around the population is a very rigid container with very strict rules about getting in and out. Whereas a movement is a very loose container, has very loose boundaries. So how rigid or loose are the boundaries is another piece that's going to define the dynamics within the container. And then a last one, and this is the one I'm thinking about more today, is the strength, the magnetism, or the drawing potential of that container. If we're in networks or communities that are voluntary, then there has to be enough value and enough sense of getting something from being inside this boundary to make it worthwhile for people. So lots of containers you don't have any choice about. Going to school, you can choose which container to get into, but you don't really have much choice about being in one of those containers or another. But when we're getting to the point of containers that have choice around them, how strong is the magnetism, or how strong is the draw that, and that is related to the boundary, how permeable or impermeable is the boundary. So those are kind of the things we think about with containers. And so when we're thinking about our networks, we're thinking about what are the various containers, what's the big container that kind of holds us all together that we have in common, and then we move to the other pieces, and is it right-sized for our purpose? And then differences are distinctions across parts of a system. So once we've defined the big main container for the system that we're thinking about, and it might be a system like with Jim works with showing up for racial justice. It might be a system where there are people within the container, and part of their big piece of their intent is to impact things outside of the container. So then the permeability is a question, et cetera. But why did I go there?
Of maybe needing differences to create that capacity.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So, yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's like part, like, anyway, it'll either,
Okay.
thanks, Mary. No, it's good. But so within that container, I guess I was just going to say, there are containers within containers within containers. And so, and each difference is also a container. So, you know, when we're thinking about system change and we're thinking about collaboration, part of it is which container are we focusing on at the moment? Which container is the one that matters for the current problem that we're trying to address? Once we've defined that, then we look at what are the differences inside the container, and we can also look at what are the differences from the inside of the container to outside of the container. But at any rate, differences are the distinctions across the parts of the system. So, and the differences are what create tension, and that tension is what creates the energy that creates the potential for change. So if everything is, you know, if you've got a container and so let's say we've got not to pick on religion, but I'm going to just as an example, we've got a church and that's our container, and everyone in the church is essentially the same. We don't have a lot of differences. I mean, we might have a few role differences, and those could create some tension. But if essentially it's a homogeneous church, it's going to be content with itself. It's going to have found a nice balance, and it's going to be content with itself until something from the outside comes and introduces some tension. But it's not going to have much reason to change. Whereas if there are different populations within the church that have different needs and different goals, that creates tension, and that tension is what enables us to adapt and to grow. And how we work with those differences is what's important, because we can make them, we can use them for energy, for positive change, or we can try to suppress the tension or control the tension or repress certain parts of the differences, and we can create a brittle, non-resilient structure that is more likely to collapse. So differences can be all kinds of things like interests, assets, experience, cultures and norms, learning styles, identities, roles within the system. So going back to the church, you might end up having some tension between parishioners and the priests or ministers, that might become a tension because there's a difference there, or between, if it's Catholic Church, you got your nuns and your priests. But so where are the differences in the system and where is that, and how does that, can that those differences be leveraged for change is key to self-organizing systems and key to thinking about how to work with your system. And kinds of power, obviously, is another kind of difference. And then lastly, exchanges. An exchange is a flow or a transfer of energy or resources or information across the different agents within the system. So across the differences, or, you know, sometimes they're just, you know, among people who are the same and they're not going across the differences. So you want to be very, think about what's the structure, what are the patterns of the exchanges, who's exchanging what with whom. They could be funding, they could be friendship, language, skill swaps, trust, collaborations, influence, barter, just plain old help. Anything that moves information, resources, energy around. My ear is doing a weird thing. It's echoing in my head. Okay, I think I fixed it. So thinking about exchanges is another piece of that. Okay, so according to the human systems dynamics theory of change and their fundamental way of looking at the world, we have a system which has a container, it has differences, and it has agents interacting. Those exchanges, those interactions create patterns. Some will happen all the time, and some kinds of interactions or exchanges will never happen. And so they create these patterns, and those patterns down here start to be replicated and, you know, ripple out, and that creates system-wide patterns. So then pretty soon the whole system has a set of patterns, like, you know, the minister or the priest gets up in front of everybody on Sunday and talks at them. And, you know, during that, no one would speak, depending on the context, of course. But so that's a kind of pattern that once those patterns emerge, anybody who enters the space kind of can see those patterns right away. You know, you spend a week in a new job sort of checking everything out, and pretty soon you're like, okay, you get it, and you conform to the norms of that system. And then that, of course, influences future interactions, because, you know, the interactions create the patterns, and the patterns constrain future interactions, so that you end up with this feedback loop of patterns that keep things the way they are often. So often this is self-organizing, means, you know, you might push it a little out of shape, but it will kind of come back to its norms, unless you do some really intelligent, deep thinking about what's going on and work hard to shift those patterns. So we looked at the three conditions of a complex adaptive system: the container, differences, and exchanges. The theory of change then is that those things create patterns, which then are recreating themselves. So this feedback loop of a complex adaptive system. Adaptive action is always going on, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And then we have pattern logic. So once you add these two practices and an understanding of these two practices or areas of thinking, interject them into the complex adaptive system, then you have some ability to start to think about how to shift things. Now, I talk about the adaptive action, this what, so what, now what cycle a lot, and we all do, and it, you know, it's used in other contexts as well. So it's not just owned by human systems dynamics by any means, but it's focused on a lot and used a lot in human systems dynamics. It's a fundamental practice. But today I'm going to look at it a little differently, because I also like the ladder of inference, which is just another way of saying the same thing. So there's different, I mean, there's meditation practices that say this as well. So this is just another angle into what's going on in our, okay, we see something happening. It's out there, event happened. I watched two coworkers have an exchange, or I had an experience with a coworker. That's the actual experience. What do we do? There's a bunch of things that we do in our minds unconsciously or consciously. I mean, we just sort of automatically do them when we have an experience that happens between when we have the experience and when we respond to the experience or act based on that experience. And the first is we select some data. So we don't necessarily notice everything that was going on in the room. We just notice the thing that stuck out for us and that we're responding to. So, or we might say, okay, I'm going to intentionally gather a bunch of data and put it in a pile and look at it. But at any rate, there's some selected data. When we look at that data, then we add some meaning to it. So we figure out what we think that meant. We make some assumptions because we can't know the meaning of everything, if things that are coming from outside of us. We don't actually know what was going on in that person's head, or what caused certain things. We're making meaning, but we're also making assumptions. We're coming to conclusions. So we've made an assumption. We're like, oh, that person doesn't like this kind of dynamic. So we say, okay, well, I guess I won't do that around that person ever because it didn't work well. And then we have beliefs. Yeah, I don't do that with that person. You'll be in trouble. So then you start to act on it. So this we're always doing, consciously or unconsciously. We do it, sometimes just like that. But it's sort of like the brain process of responding to experience and taking action. And the point,
Christine,
ahead,
just a question, is that the reflexive loop is the action loop? Is acting?
That's what I'm going to say right now. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah. So before we get to action, we go through all these things. And the reflexive loop is we go through all those steps, selecting data, adding meaning, assumptions, conclusions, and beliefs before we act. We can do that reflexively, which means we just did it unconsciously. We didn't really think about it. It was just a knee-jerk sort of conclusion. And reflective learning is when we say, okay, I'm going to slow this down. I'm going to think about what else was going on. I'm going to think about, am I selecting the right data? Am I responding to the right experience? Is my experience full enough? Or what I'm responding to full enough? Is the meaning I'm adding, is this actually the meaning that the best meaning that I could add? If I explored a different meaning, might I have a different outcome? So we go through this whole ladder of inference. If we're being reflective and we're engaging in reflective learning, we do our best to go through the whole ladder of inference, paying attention and making choices. So part of the point is, if we go through the reflexive loop, we're not actually making choices. We're just getting triggered based on, our normal mental biases or habits or past experience. So the reflective loop or the reflexive loop isn't exercising a whole lot of choice in the process generally. The reflective learning loop is saying, okay, at every single step of the way, I'm going to make some choices. I'm going to decide, am I selecting the right data? I'm going to ask myself, I'm going to maybe get some more input about what is the meaning here. I'm going to question my assumptions, explore different conclusions. That's going to impact my beliefs differently, and I will take different actions. So the reflective learning part of the loop is highlighting that we have choices at every step of the way. And so I think that when we're trying to collaborate together, we have this sort of often group think thing that just sort of jumps from actual experience to like conclusions. Here's a problem, here's a solution, we're going to go do it together. And part of what I feel like I've been really trying to focus on the last couple of years in our community practice and trying to figure out how to help get the map to help us do is to slow that down and take each step to give us more information to work with and explore our possible meanings and assumptions and conclusions from more angles and with more input, so that we are making conscious, intentional choices at every step of the way, so that when we get to the point of actions or solutions, that we've actually made sure that we're sort of on the best track that we can be on at the moment. Not perfect, maybe not the final one, but it's the best that we could do right now, and we know that it's better than our sort of knee-jerk reflexive loop actions. And if we're doing it together collectively, we're actually going to increase the effectiveness or the appropriateness even more than if we do it by ourselves. And so that's part of what a social system map does, is enables us to have a means of looking together, of collectively going through all of these steps at the level of our community, of our intended efforts. So I like the adaptive action cycle in the HSD diagram, because it's succinct and clear and simple, but it leaves out this, some of the steps of the process that are going on automatically mentally, and it doesn't distinguish between the reflexive way of doing adaptive action and the reflective way of doing adaptive action. So I wanted to throw this in here today just to sort of give us another way of looking at it. But basically, it's the same thing. What is the same as this? It's just parsing it and thinking about it a little more, so in a slightly more visually sophisticated way here. So the HSD theory of change is saying that if this complex adaptive system is there and it has these patterns, and these patterns are very much reinforcing each other and creating this feedback loop that kind of keeps bringing it back to some norm that, feels comfortable to the majority, if whatever, maybe it feels terrible, but it's just what we're used to. When that is going on, the first thing, the most important thing we can do is to slow down our own reactions to it, is to slow down our own ladder of inference, to take a step back, to say, to just take a step back and to say, at every one of those steps in the ladder of inference, what choices do I have here? What choices do I have here to actually do it reflectively as opposed to reflexively? So that is the first piece of the theory of change, which is that the more conscious and careful we are with the way we interpret what's going on and react to what's going on, the more we'll be able to actually start to shift these, the exchanges within the system, to start to shift, the container itself, perhaps to shift the differences, to include more differences in the system, or to balance the differences differently. So that's the first piece of the HSD theory of change. And then we get to this business, which Glenda, who's the founder of Human Systems Dynamics, calls pattern logic. And the pattern logic is just any kind of a framework or a methodology or a tool that helps us when we're doing our ladder of inference. So when we're down here, if we have frameworks that help us say, okay, you're always selecting the data, you're always looking at this kind of data, but there's other kinds of data. Maybe you should be looking at data about the exchanges, or maybe you should be looking at data about other kinds of dynamics. Any framework that helps us slow down, start to look at the facts or at the system in ways that we're not normally doing habitually, because we all have our normal ways of looking and of seeing and of perceiving. So any tool that helps us think differently and approach this whole process from some different perspectives is essentially what Glenda will call these, in her system-y language, mid-level abstractions. Any kind of mid-level abstraction, any kind of framework that helps us think differently is a pattern logic, because it's helping us get logical and explore the actual patterns that are going on in this complex adaptive system. So that then as we're going through our adaptive action cycle or our ladder of inference, if we're using any kind of pattern logic tools, different ones are going to work in different contexts better, or different times require different pattern logic tools. But anything that helps us have more choices and more perspectives as we're climbing that ladder of inference helps us to make wiser choices once we get to the complex adaptive, once we get to acting within the system. So that's the HSD theory of change. Now, how all of this works with social system mapping is basically a social system map is a visualization to the best of our ability to make it now, given the technology and given, you know, how much information people will share about how they fit within a system. But a social system map is basically a picture of the containers, the differences, and the exchanges within your system, within your network. So that is, the more you use it, thinking about the C, the D, and the E, as we call them, thinking about what are the containers here? What are the differences here? What are the exchanges? Looking at the patterns that we can see in that social system map. So we can start with a picture of the map, and then as we deepen our practice, we can start to sense the patterns that what we can see help us understand are in the background, and then we can start to shift those patterns. So it's a tool, a mid-level abstraction for looking at a complex adaptive system at the scale of the network. So you probably don't need one of these in a family or in a small team, but once we get to that point of where we're trying to make systemic change, we're trying to include people from different parts of the system with different system perspectives, we can't see all of those things as individuals. We can't see that. We can't see a network. We can't see the exchanges that are happening in that network, who's supporting who in what way. And so since we can't see it, it's very hard for us to really think super clearly about, you know, as we do the ladder inference, we don't have as much information as we could have. So if we have a social system map, we have more to work with at the level, at the scale of a change network. And so we can easily just say a social system map is a pattern logic for a very specific context, for a very specific scale. I think, okay. So that's the HSD theory of change, and then how a social system map fits with that. So lastly, once more, containers, differences, exchanges. My ear is doing that funny thing again. Okay, so let me just stop sharing for a second. If anybody has any comments or questions they want to say, just, I'm pausing my voice for a moment, so this is space for your voice if you would like to. Is there anything you want to share or think about?
Well, it seems critical that all of this is sort of known as you're creating the map. So people are participating in the map. Otherwise, you're not seeing all of those things you're talking about. You're still sort of bumping around in the dark.
Yeah, Mary, thanks for that. I think, I mean, I've made a lot of social system maps, and I have tried approaching it from like sharing the CDE model up front, and generally it doesn't work very well because it's too abstract. It's not, it's just too out there for most people. But but the most important piece, I think, is as much engagement from as many different perspectives as you can get, so that your map building process sort of reflects that adaptive action system or complex adaptive system as much as possible. You can get there without being explicit, and then over time I get more and more explicit about, okay, what are the differences here? What do we need? What differences are we that, you know, make a difference that we're not seeing, that we should be asking about, et cetera? What are the things that hold us together, the containers? And so, but what you point to of including the people in the network and the different perspectives in the network is key to, you know, like, I don't like to say you have to have X, Y, and Z, because what I think you have to do is just get started and experiment your way to something that's generative. And if you can only start with 2 people, you do your best and you push on them to think outside the box. But the more systemic your starting point, the better you're going to have, the quicker you're going to have good outcomes. Okay.
Christine,
Yeah.
since you asked for comments, I was thinking that the CDE actually feels really practical and logical to me.
Yes.
Abstract, and people don't want to go there, but it's like, oh yeah, that's how you put it all together and make it make sense.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that way too. And but I feel like there's you know, with systems thinking in general, systems thinking comes out of a sciencey sort of, I mean, it's like the magical piece of science, you know, so but there is still a potential for feeling, for making people feel like this is, you know, sort of a Western white ontology that is being imposed on other kinds of ontologies. And so the language piece is very, very, I mean, this is part of what I feel like we're often need to be asking ourselves as mappers is, are we, you know, is my way of, am I imposing my way of seeing the world on a group of people that sees it in a different way and has other things to bring to the table? So just like to be very careful with the language. And but they're so simple. The containers, the differences in the exchanges are so simple that once you get comfortable with them, you can use whatever wording feels right. You can say, what is it that holds us together? What is it that bring, you know, that we have in common, as opposed to container? But it is a very good formula for helping us keep in mind to look from those different angles. Does that make sense, Jan, what I'm saying? Yeah,
and you could use, yeah, so it's like we talk about parts of the system or nodes in the network or whatever it may be. But you're just saying make it really practical language that people are not alienated by, I think.
Yeah. And maybe sometimes even it's not practical, but it's reflects people in the community that have been marginalized or that have been have experienced having ontological dominance imposed on them, and so that they feel not alienated. I mean, so not simply practical is very important, but also a way of helping increase people's sense of belonging.
Which gets back to what Mary said and you reinforced around when you're looking at the containers, you know, containers having all of the.
Your cat is helping you mute.
My cat muted me.
Time for breakfast.
I should be listening to his perspective.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, none of this is working for me.
He's eating part of my banana. That's what he's trying to do. So yeah, having all those differences in the room when you're looking at the system that you have labeled in its containers, they can say, oh, this is the way it works. Oh no, there's another container over here. So having more than a couple of wonky system sciencey people looking at it.
Yeah. Jim.
Yeah, this makes me think of, I usually think of difference in terms of different perspective, different ideas, the ability with a lot of difference to create the cognitive tension for exchange of ideas and so forth, or maybe even resources that, oh, we have these different resources here. Now we can exchange those. There's the tension there is like, I don't have these resources, I need them. Oh, I have extra resources. But I was thinking about sort of behavioral change tension. So for example, if I come in with a very in your face male, you know, cisgendered male kind of way of talking over everybody and stuff. And the tension there is like, yeah, in this community, we don't operate that way. You stand back when you're in that position. That creates a tension of change from that difference. And then I start thinking about actions. What if we're not just exchanging ideas and using the tensions to move our cognitive thinking forward? Oh, so in that case, that was a relational change. Is there's a tension and I have to make a personal transformation if I want to play. Yep. So I've got skin in the game there. So what if we're actually talking about stakeholders? So we've got this tension of different stakeholders and we're trying to build something together. I'm having to give up things, or I'm having to add things, or you're having to give up things. so that as we work together, where the tension is actually not just cognitive, it's not even just relational, it's actually moving, shifting the way we are in the system. And it seems to me those are different things. I've been thinking about it mostly in terms of ideas, you know, brokerage of ideas and who has access to what information. But I haven't been thinking of it in terms of power, relationships, and actual the things that you do when you work together, when you collaborate.
Yeah, well, you just sort of teed up where we're going with this next, because that was agree with Siggy. Thumbs up. Did you want to comment before we move forward, Siggy? Yeah.
Because I joined late, I'm trying to grasp everything what you're saying, and then not only that, using the container, I need to understand what you really meant it, although I was working in a network mapping and I'm using notes and stuff. So it might take me a bit of time to come in terms of comment, but it seems like that's what we're doing already anyway in the community. And that's what we're trying to achieve in terms of bringing people together and sharing ideas and finding out how we can come together from different aspects of life, ideas and stuff. So I'm learning. I'm learning.
Well, Siggy, I just want to reiterate, and you might not have been here when but all of this is both conceptually complex and deep, and it's not a thing that, you know, like I have been aware of human systems dynamics and, you know, introduced to the fundamental things probably 10 years ago, or more. Actually, I used the CDE in my graduate thesis in 2010. So, you know, I've known about this stuff for a long time, but then I got did the practitioners training a couple of years ago. And I'm still just, as I apply it to our community of practice, it just gets deeper and deeper. And it's like, it's so simple that it's easy to dismiss, or it's easy to go, yeah, I get it, and move on. But it takes, it's a sort of the more we work with it, every month I look at these things again to present them again. I find another way into it, another way of expressing it. So no one should ever feel like, oh, I don't really get it, because I don't really get, like, we're never going to really get it, because it's like living, right? It's just like, there's always more to learn. So I just wanted to say that. So I just, so you don't feel like there's some intellectual bar that you're not rising up to. And just for the network's sake, so for those of you who know Drew Mackey, Drew has worked with Siggy on making her map in London. So that's a connection that we have through.
Great.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about, and Jim, you sort of touched on this already, which is when I talk about systems of dominance and systems of connection, what I mean is a very, very deep, nuanced, interpersonal thing. So if you and I have 10 minutes together, I'm noticing who's dominating, how are they dominating, are they not dominating, like how in that 10 minutes of just you and me, just planning, like how to set a calendar, or just doing the simplest things, I'm noting the dynamics between us, the power dynamics, the habits we have of speaking together, the way we express our relationship to each other. And so for me, it's a very, very intimate thing of systems of dominance and systems of connection. I noticed that when we talk about this in community, it often feels like what we're talking about is, you know, capitalism. Yeah, system of dominance, exploitation, extraction, no argument from me here. Capitalism is what's showing up in the 10 minutes as well, you know, so like, are we talking about the justice system and the racism in the justice system? That's huge. It's important. It's absolutely what we want to change. I'm not saying it's not the target of our goals, but I can't practice changing the capitalist system at the policy level, but I can practice it one-on-one between you and me. I can notice, you know, what is it, are we being transactional here? Are we being, is there some kind of power dynamic here? Are we having reverence for one another? So there's this whole range of what we could mean. And what part of our defining of systems of dominance to systems of connection is finding the ways of defining those two systems in a way that we can actually practice. Like we can define, we can say this clear enough that when we show up, like Jim, you know, showing it, referring to, you know, if he shows up in a sort of typical in your face, rather generally theoretical or abstract, you know, cis white male way, we have ways of saying, that's actually not what we're here to do. And we're going to invite you into showing up in a different way. We're going to invite you into exploring other ways of being with us together and seeing how those feel to you. So that's, maybe I'm getting too far afield in my thinking, but anyway, that's what I've been thinking a lot about that in this context, partly because what I recognize is that if the container that we're positing is not in alignment with the differences that we have in our network and with the exchanges, the patterns of the exchanges, our system is not very much in integrity. So if we say we're a system to combat racism, but we're marginalizing, maybe not marginalizing based on skin color, but maybe marginalizing on background or on other things, you say, okay, well, are the exchanges that are actually happening in the system and the differences that exist in the system, they're not actually in alignment with what we're saying is the purpose of the system. So we're going to end up with a system that isn't as in integrity. When people are stuck in those systems because they can't get out because of, you know, it's school and they have to go to school or whatever, you know, there's lots of systems we're stuck in. That lack of alignment or integrity between the containers and the differences and the exchanges creates a toxic system. It's creating problems for somebody. In a voluntary system, if it's a network, what it's creating is just lack of engagement. Like people just won't show up if they feel like, you know, I'm here to combat racism, and I show up and I'm really not seeing, like I'm seeing a lot of talk about it and I'm seeing maybe a lot of theorizing, but I'm not actually seeing a deep practice around combating racism. I'm going to say, well, this is not doing what I came here to do, and I'm going to leave. So then we have this sort of problem of what we call lack of engagement. But maybe it's not lack of engagement. Maybe it's lack of alignment between how your container is working, how your differences are working, and how your exchanges are working. And so that's how I've been looking at the lack of engagement in our community. So when I feel like, oh, people aren't helping me, oh, I'm so annoyed, you know, rather than try to figure out how to control them and get them to help me more, I figure out, okay, what's wrong with the exchanges? What's wrong with the difference? And what isn't, you know, if I break it down into these different things and examine them, how can I start to shift them and see if that increases engagement and see if that helps to make it a better, a more functional system. So what we're going to do next is part of me exploring, you know, the part of this exploration I've been doing for the last couple of years about how our community actually is a system together and what are the patterns in it, and how can I start to help shift those patterns so that the rest of everybody who shows up can also be part of this system creating, pattern generating thing to make it what we want to be part of, what all of us wants to be part of. And so one of the steps of that was, well, we need to define what we're talking about when we're talking about dominance, exploitation, and extraction, and what we're talking about when we're talking about connection, regeneration, and reverence. And so we're going to, for the next couple months, be doing an exploration. It's an experiment. I don't quite know how to enter into this. I don't quite know how to make this happen. I don't have a top-down plan. I sort of have I'm going to introduce it. I'm going to sort of inch forward. I'm going to see what, you know, where there's a little bit of energy, where there's traction. If anybody who shows up to be part of it what do they represent when they show up to be part of it? What do we do with what shows up? So we'll be working on that. So part of this is me in today's session is starting to practice talking about this exploration that we're going to do within our community, and sort of doing a first little touch on it. And I'll share with you one piece of the engagement thing that I put into place. But I also wanted us to take a couple minutes together using AHA Slides, but AHA Slides isn't being super, well, we'll see, there's not a whole lot of us, so we'll just see what happens. But I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen, and we'll just do this briefly because I wanna give us some time to reflect at the end together. And
Christine, can you summarize in a sentence like what that experiment is again for me?
The experiment is to figure out how to have this conversation of so before our community of practice, so we have a container. So there's lots of containers in this context. I'm not summarizing very well. I'll try to do that after I say, I'm gonna expand just a little bit more. But one of the containers is me, because I've been generating this for years, this community of practice. So I'm one of my personality, people liking or caring, just thinking there's something interesting about me. So I'm part of the container. Not nearly enough. Another container is social system mapping, but social system mapping can be used in a lot of ways, and we can see ways that it can be used in top-down extractive ways, and that is definitely not the intention of it. So another container then has to be the value purpose, which is shifting from systems of dominance to systems of using mapping for this shift of this paradigm shift. So that's part of the container, but so in order to figure out our exchanges is the way our community practice, like our community practice has to be in alignment with that purpose. Otherwise it's a useless community practice. But we can't really tell if we're in alignment if we haven't defined what that means. So right now the experiment is defining in a generic way, for starters, what do systems of dominance, exploitation, and what are the patterns, what works in those, and what works in the others? And then from that, we'll start to figure out how to apply that, how to actually make that a living practice in our community of practice, so that then our exchanges are in alignment and in coherence with our most important container.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
I have to take a breather before my 9:30, so I'm going to leave right at this juncture, but I'll come back to the slides and the recording.
Well, and you'll come back to this discussion because
Yes.
you're stuck. So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jen.
And maybe, well, let's just do a couple of these slides just to see if you guys have thoughts, because now that I've brought it all up, I don't want to. And if you don't, if you say, or like, I'm done, I don't need to do this slide business, just put your hand up and then I'll know to move on. But so the first question I had that for us to think about is, what are the norms or the conditions that generate or reinforce systems of dominance, exploitation, and extraction? And I think that slide should be up in AHA Slides. And I invite you to go ahead and put them in. And you can put them in as separate ideas because you can keep putting new ideas in. So feel free to separate them out as if they were each on their own post-it, as it were. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I wish I could put input at the moment, but I can't.
This could take a while to list all these things, so I just put 5 in there.
Yeah, no, and I'm realizing this is I'm getting to the point of a session where I'm kind of wanting to like start to zoom, like speed up, because we're getting to the end, and this is not a speed up kind of a topic.
No, yeah.
And so I'll just sort of thank you, Jan, for inputting, and whoever else has put stuff in, emphasis on growth and scale is primary. Yeah. Lack of awareness that our network is a living system. Yep, all of those things. I'm going to just sort of move through the slides so you can, just to share what I was thinking. We don't have to all put them, but no, you're putting stuff in there. Great. Just operate like a game of Monopoly. Yep. Yep. Winning is exactly. Yeah. Good question if that can be fixed. I mean, I have that question everywhere, like in my own self. So how much can we change that? I hope a lot, but nonetheless. So then the next question I was going to ask you, and I'm not going to ask you to put input now, was just to start to, so those, those are sort of system level expressions of dominance, et cetera. And I was going to ask you to think a little bit about how those norms and conditions show up in our well-intended community work. And some of you already commented on that, like just, thinking that scale and numbers is success can definitely be a way that, thing that happens in community work. But I was going to ask you to think a little bit more about that. And then I was going to ask you to think about the norms or conditions that generate and reinforce systems of connection, reverence, and regeneration. And then I was going to ask you to think about that, how those show up in our community work, how we can make those patterns ever more prevalent in our 10 minutes as we're scheduling something, as well as in our, our hour-long presentational meetings, shared learning meetings, planning meetings, all that sort of thing. So I'm gonna just go through, because I realized that it's a little out of alignment for me to be in I'm trying to speed up mode at this point. And I want to share with you the next steps, but let's take a couple of minutes. I'd like to hear what's coming up for people, what you're thinking. Gabe, we haven't heard from you, and I'm not wanting to ask you to if you don't feel like it, but I do invite you to either unmute and say if you have thoughts you want to share, or put it in the chat, which is not a welcome. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Christine, and everybody. So I'm new here, and I really felt like mostly I should listen and absorb stuff rather than, I don't know that I have as much to contribute, but I'm very interested in the ideas that kind of brought me to come and want to learn more today. And it just makes me feel good to know that other people are trying to find better ways. I was the one that wrote that question or the comment about corporations and what winning looks like to them. And I think that's just such a huge problem that we should be wrestling with.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have comments or thoughts before I sort of get into my last little piece?
I just think this is really needed and sort of up, so to speak, and just the steps that you were going to go in would be a good thing for a deep dive conversation, or especially, if we are able to see that in advance and sort of think about it over a period of time before that session.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I have a plan.
And I guess the second thing quickly, somehow we talked about reversal just in the last few weeks, and I've been looking a lot at that, and that seems to have to do with, rather than blaming others or maybe blaming the system, of really being able to look at yourself. You are the system, and so this fits in.
See, if you don't feel like you have to respond, but I'm just curious if any of this feels useful for, like, within the network, within the mapping practice you already have, within the work you're already doing within your community, if any of this feels either affirming or suggestive of something new to try?
It's actually something we need in terms of the community. I mean, there is a social systems built, but the connection between, as you said, the container and the others and stuff. And then I really want to follow it up, because if we find a solution for that, then we'll be able to solve lots of problems in our community. So it's new for me, as I said, but I would like to understand it by myself, step by step. And then, but it's the language you're speaking, although it seems like that it's new for now for the community, but it's something that we use already in a different term.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to hear more about it, where we're going from here. Yeah.
And at some point, I would like to hear about the language you're already using and how,
yeah,
you know, because this is a language I've been taught and I know, and I recognize that it's a language from a certain perspective, and
yeah,
for me to be more fluent and able to use other ways of talking about this would be really helpful. So
yeah,
that's a thing.
definitely. Yeah. As I said, you know, looking at and not as a network mapping side of it, but as a community developer side of it as well, is something that what you talked about it just now is something that we really want to work on, you know, in terms of engagement, why people is not coming to the social system, why we're not growing the social system, why we're not strengthening that, is all that. But I'm just because it's new, it's a good thing. We kind of thinking about it before, but now you're putting it in a step. So I would like to see where this research goes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your comments. Appreciate it. So Mary, to what you, so I'll just confess, sort of, I don't know if it's a confession or what it is, but when I planned this session, my first thought was, I'm just not going to do all that stuff I always do. I'm just not going to do the, what is it, the, you know, the blah and the blah. I was just going to sort of jump right into, I made a mural. So this is, like I said, this is the first step in what we hope is a longer, deeper, more ecosystemic conversation and exploration. And so I had prepared, I'm going to just give you a link now so that you can have access to it. Since I do a lot of things using a mural board and put questions and then ask people to put Post-its and stuff in their mural board, I had started by creating a mural board for this exploration, not for this particular session. And when I first thought to do the session, I was like, I'll just jump to the mural board. And then I was like, no, there will be new people who won't understand what I'm talking about. I should start from the, you know, so I was trying to sort of mash two things together in today's session. And we mostly got to the introductory piece, but I think that was a good setup. I hope it was a halfway good setup. And so, Mary, there is a mural board where I asked some questions like, what are some frameworks that could help us with this exploration, and who might be interested in being part of this exploration, and how might you be interested in it? And also the defining of the systems. There's a big place to put Post-its about those.
The link isn't working for me. Have others tried it for the mural board?
Yeah, not working for me either.
Okay, hang on. I will get it straight from the horse's mouth because I handy.
A Minnesota turn.
Yep, a Minnesota turn.
Mm-hmm.
And then for those of you, so I just wanted to say that, and then for those of you who are new to our community or are just new to this practice and would like to typing quickly, making typos, but I just put a link in the chat where you can put yourself on our map. So if you're not on our map and you would just like to have an experience of walking through the process and seeing, even if you're not actively engaged in our community of practice, if you're on our map, you'll sort of get exposed to the ways that we're pursuing this exploration and the ways we're furthering our mapping practice and trying to deepen the process. So please put yourself on the map if you are at all inclined. If you're on our map and haven't updated it recently, I'm putting a link that will enable you to, if you click on that link, put your email in, it will send you your personal link that the map, that you can go update your stuff if you're already in there. And then lastly, I just wanted to share, we're sort of working on this, the community practice portal. We'll tell you more about the community of practice, about the process, the practice of social system mapping, and then what we're up to. It's all still under development, but there's enough stuff there to play with. And so I put all those links in the chat. And I appreciate this is a lot of me talking, and I appreciate that you stuck through it. And this is a norm that I keep trying to figure out how to shift. And sometimes anyway, it's a process of figuring out how to make it the dynamics different. But so thank you for that. And let's do we have a little goodbye ritual that we do at the end of the hour, which is we all unmute. I count down 3, 2, 1, and then we all just give each other our wishes and blessings and love for the rest of the day. So unless anybody has anything burning, I know you all have to get off. It's the end of the bottom of the hour. So let's go ahead and do that. Ready, Siggy? Unmuted? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead. Okay, yay. Ready? So 3, 2, 1. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Nice seeing everyone.
Nice to meet everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave.
Hope to see you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.